Hey, everybody, welcome to The Thoughtful Bro. I am live with the fabulous, legendary Steve Almond for another special episode of Thoughtful Bro airing on A Mighty Blaze. A few words before we get started. For those who don't know, A Mighty Blaze is an all-volunteer initiative which started at the beginning of COVID, and here we are, just had our second birthday. We basically, it's so sweet, we don't look a day over one. We're here because at the beginning of COVID, all our friends had book tours that got canceled, and we wanted to find ways for writers to connect with readers during COVID, and it's really taken off. So thank you to everybody who supported us. And if you're new to A Mighty Blaze and you want to show the love, we're not asking for any money. Just like or subscribe on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. That's all we need. If you want to do a little bit more than that or get some more information about A Mighty Blaze, you can go to amightyblaze.com. And there you can sign up for our newsletter. And every Sunday night, you will get a list of all the interviews we're doing that week. We're usually talking to people who have just put out a book that week or that day. In the case of Steve, this is the very first interview he's doing on the day that his book is launching. So super fortunate to have him here today. But yeah, we're never going to spam you with anything. You just get this newsletter and says, hey, here's the interviews coming up this week on A Mighty Blaze. If you are in the mood to spend money, though, I have an idea. I think you should spend it on debut fiction by legendary short story and nonfiction writers who have just put out their very first novel. Books like All the Secrets of the World by the great Steve Almond. Please go ahead and buy one copy or 10. We're going to put the link into the chat to buy it and support local indie bookstores on bookshop.org. So please go ahead, indulge that urge, and click buy. Regarding questions, if you want to ask a question to Steve, just put it in the chat on YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook, and it will make its way through the interwebs to me. And finally, a teaser for next week. I'm going to have on Trisha Blanchett, who runs the podcast for A Mighty Blaze. Trisha is also a debut novelist. She's written a YA fantasy book called Herrick's End. So excited to have Trisha on the show next week. It's always nice to have a Mighty Blazer on the Mighty Blaze. But with that, we're going to get started. Steve Almond is the author of 12 books of fiction and nonfiction, including the New York Times bestsellers Candyfreak and Against Football. For 4 years, Steve hosted the New York Times Dear Sugars podcast with the great Cheryl Strayed. His short stories have been anthologized all over the place in the Best American Short Stories, the Pushcart Prize, Best American Erotica, and Best American Mystery Series. And All the Secrets of the World, look at this beautiful cover, also behind Steve. All the Secrets of the World is his first novel, which he spent 30 years trying to write a novel, and we're going to talk about that process. But it's a fantastic book, and I read it over about 2 days. And don't take it from me, take it from Anthony Doerr, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of All the Light We Cannot See, who had this to say, which I think really exquisitely sums it up. He said of this book, it's at once a media critique, a coming-of-age story, a meticulously plotted police procedural, an exploration of racial paranoia, and a haunting account of lust and longing on the fringes of what is allowable. Whew. That sounds great. Steve, welcome to the show.
I paid a lot of money for that blurb.
What a great blurb. Oh my God. That blurb was sort of a work of art in itself. And it just captured everything. So Steve, this is so exciting. For those who don't know, and I bet almost none of you know, Steve and I play poker every Thursday night. Steve's had a poker game that he's had going for 20 or 30 years, and I was lucky enough to start playing with him a couple years ago. So there may, if you stay tuned, be a question about poker strategy, but you'll have to stick around just to see if I'm going to ask him about poker. Steve, this is so great, and we're going to talk on this show about why it took you 30 years to write a novel, because you've just basically done everything else a writer can do except write a novel, and it sort of does not compute in some way that you wouldn't also be a novelist. But I think you have so much that's so interesting to say about that. And so we're going to get to that. But why don't we, just to kick it off, Steve, just give us like the thumbnail sketch of this book. What's it about?
Yeah, I mean, it's okay. Thumbnail sketch. It's initially the collision of two families, the family of Lorena Saenz, who's a 13-year-old American citizen, but her family She's an immigrant from Honduras, and her family is undocumented, and they do not have a lot of money. She lives with her mom on her own, and she's paired with Jenny Stallworth, who is the wealthy, glamorous classmate that everybody admires in her grade, seventh grade. They're paired for a science project, which seems innocent enough. This is set in 1981 in Sacramento, California. And that was the age before people just did a Google Doc and, text and whatever. You had to actually go visit people in their homes. And the moment that Lorena, this young woman who's fiercely intelligent, ambitious, courageous, walks into the Stallworth house, she is kind of absolutely stunned and enthralled, and becomes visible in particular ways to both of the Stallworth parents, in ways that, and tempted in particular ways that she is too young to realize really endangers her and her people, her mother and her brother in particular. So they are sucked into the vortex of a police investigation, a huge media scandal, and the machinations, political, moral, and otherwise, kind of travel up the chain from the police and prosecutors and criminal justice system, and eventually the correctional system, all the way up to Nancy Reagan, who bizarrely has an important cameo in this novel. And it's also sort of the leitmotifs of the book are scorpions, astrology, the zodiac versus astronomy, kind of science versus faith. So it took me a long time to write, and therefore I tried to just stuff everything I could into one book.
Yeah, the book I love the one thing about this book. There's so many great things to say about it, but it's certainly one thing to say is like it's not what it appears to be at first, and then it begins to appear to be something else, and then it's not that either, and then it's not that either, and it's sort of so many different things. But it all starts so innocently, doesn't it? I mean, it's just these two friends in school. Like, what could go wrong?
Right. The answer is everything. But of course, for me, part of what allowed me to write a novel after hacking away at terrible novels for so long is what I call this chain of consequence. Or I don't think I call it. I think that's just like what it's called. And I found that to describe it, that is there are all these unintended consequences that are usually generated by the fact that the characters are keeping secrets from one another, and more dangerously, they're keeping secrets from themselves, so that each of the scenes is really a moment where secrets are being revealed and kind of exploding into view, and then instigating the next plot point. This took me, I know it sounds simple in the description, Mark, but it took me a long time to get it through my thick skull that I needed to have, that the scenes in the novel needed to introduce and escalate tension and do character work, but they also, and crucially, needed to instigate what was going to happen next. And that once the reader, and me as the writer, I attached myself to that, it became much easier to write, because I wasn't saying, oh my God, I'm going to write a novel. Do you think I'm smart? All those ego questions. I was asking, oh my God, if this just got revealed and that puts Lorena in this kind of danger, and how is she going to get herself out of it or get further into it? And it became much easier to write because I was really just chasing the story rather than trying to push it around.
Yeah, when George Saunders was on my show about a year ago, he said one of these things. It's one of the things that I always think about from that interview. And he said there's two qualities that determine whether a writer will be successful. The first is a willingness to revise, but the second is an attention to causality in the story.
Yes.
And there you go.
Yeah. And that's actually arising from where I found it described was in the Poetics. Aristotle talks about the arrangement of incidents. That's the way he talks about it. He's talking about drama and tragedy, but what he's saying is, look, character doesn't generate plot. Character isn't plot. It is by a person's actions that they are made happy or unhappy. And the way that story and true tragedy is generated is by having a satisfying arrangement of incidents. And if that's my interpretation, is he's really talking about this chain of consequence.
Indeed. Steve, I've heard you describe this book as a social novel. And so I want to talk about that for a moment, because first, who are the great social novelists? What is a social novel? I mean, like there's a great essay by Tom Wolfe, who I'm sure people would call a social novelist. It's called Stalking the Billion-Footed Beast. We'll link to that in the chat, but that's sort of a manifesto about, why there aren't as many social novels anymore like there used to be, and sort of how nonfiction is almost outstripping fiction in terms of like a realistic portrayal of society. And he sort of calls out in this essay for social novelists to basically step up to the plate and take their place among the other kinds of novelists. And I guess, so just my first question to you is, I want to hear you define what a social novel is, but I kind of also want to hear you then say, like, where are we at with the social novel, and like what place does it have in the literary kind of trendiness or non-trendiness of today?
Yeah, I mean, so a social novel is a book that is trying to examine the fate of individual characters who are trapped in larger systems of power. We go back to Hugo with Les Mis, and he has this brilliant introduction, one-sentence introduction, in which he says essentially, so long as there prevails on earth circumstances where, there's a spiritual and material impoverishment for women, and children live in bondage, and poverty persists and so forth, there shall be necessary this sort of book. He's basically laying down his marker and saying, look, if the world is broken, then it is partly the novelist's charge to address that in some way, not by having a lesson or wagging their finger, but by dramatizing what happens when people in society who have power collide with people who do not have power. Like somebody like Nancy Reagan, who is at the apex of American power. Her behaviors, though I believe within her psychology, they are understandable to us, and maybe even we can sympathize with them, they are also so monstrously naive that they have these horrible calamitous effects on Lorena Saenz and her family, who have almost no power. The reason there aren't more, and so that tradition continues through Dickens, most of his novels, Dostoevsky, most of his novels, and on through the American tradition where you have Zora Neale Hurston and De Passos and Ralph Ellison, Visible Man, and Steinbeck certainly. But the catch is, the reason there aren't more social novels is because novelists with our little novelist wings and writers in general live in a place that is way further up on the Maslowian sort of hierarchy. We're worried about how to survive the history of our families and how to find love and how to be creatively actualized and all that stuff, which is really important, but it's further up the chain of privilege than the question of what are the powerless going to do when they are sucked into the machine of power. And that's, I think, the reason why there aren't more social novels is, especially now, as you alluded to, novelists sort of think, well, that's kind of the job of journalism. That's kind of the job of nonfiction, to examine the world and these larger systems. And if I get caught up in that mission, I'm just going to be sort of preaching a sermon. But to me, the most exciting books, I'm thinking of like Megha Majumdar's A Burning, which absolutely set me on fire when I read it last year or the year before. This new novel by my former student and friend, Melissa Chadburn, called A Tiny Upward Shove. These are books that essentially say, look, the plot of this, the thrill of this book is that I am showing you how power is colliding with the powerless, and how the kind of terrible danger that these characters are in, partly by their own actions, but also by the larger systems of power in which they operate. I think of All the Secrets of the World as a social thriller, which I don't think exists yet, but I'm kind of making my argument for that genre, because the opposite of a sermon, the opposite of a PSA from the author's superego, is just a rollicking yarn where you feel pulled through the thing. And to me, maybe it's my history as an investigative reporter or whatever, like the actual mechanics of how injustice operates in the country are deeply fascinating, because injustice implies that people are in trouble and they're going to get hurt. And there's a lot of danger. There's a lot of actual danger to people's lives and fates, but also to their moral being. In All the Secrets of the World, it's devastating because there are all these characters who believe that they're doing something important and necessary and even righteous, who the secret they're keeping from themselves is that they are part of a corrupt system and they can't see it. And when they do see it, it's devastating. So I think of like the social novel, like Grapes of Wrath, as it's thrilling. And you can describe it as a social novel and everybody yawns and goes, uh-oh, I'm going to get a lecture. But actually, it's about the fate of this poor family, and are they going to make it, and who's going to make it of them?
Yeah, and I think that there can be sort of an implication with the word social novel that this is kind of a politically driven novel, or it wants to draw attention to social issues, and so that's kind of like inherently a political action. But I think like what's so great about this book, I love social thriller. That is totally the term that should be used for this. That's exactly what it is. I mean, we'll talk a little bit more about kind of the police procedural and thriller aspects of it in a second. But, one of the things that you need to do, I think, to create a successful novel of any kind, and certainly anything that people will want to read that might have like this kind of social bent to it, is you have to have empathy for everybody. There's a great anecdote that I think is real. Sometimes I like remember these things that authors said, and then I just kind of like over time like sand them down to just what I need them for. But I think this happened. In
translation, I am misquoting now. Okay,
right. So Steinbeck this is what I think happened. He had written a play, and he worked a long time on it, and then it was about the class struggle and the corporate kind of plutocrats versus like the working man, and many of the themes in his other work, and then he like scraps the play, and he tells his friend like, "Oh, I'm not working on that anymore. That thing is never going to go anywhere." And the friend says, "Why?" And he said, "Well, I just hated the people in it. I hated them."
Yeah.
And I think that, and he knew like this is the death knell for art. When you hate somebody in your work, you will never effectively write them. And I just wanted to turn that over to you because everybody gets a fair shake in this book, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's I have read books where that sort of purport to be social novels where there's an obvious contempt, usually for the wealthy and the powerful, who are portrayed as kind of craven and selfish. And you can think about even like The Great Gatsby. They were careless people, right? Tom and Daisy Buchanan. They're in that particular book, and I'm not faulting it. I love it. But you never get to see why Daisy and Tom Buchanan are so monstrous. Like the Fitzgerald, that isn't the purview of that particular book. He's more occupied by Gatsby's tale and this idea of, can I reinvent myself? Can you overwrite the bad files of poverty, with great lavish wealth, however it's gotten? Right. So I get that, no quarrel. But for me, I just hate it when I read a book and I know that some characters are being flattened out into caricature. And for me, so for instance, the best example is somebody like Nancy Reagan, because when I started writing the book, I thought, oh, Nancy Reagan, that, astrological ditz, that Gucci drunk kind of modern Marie Antoinette, won't it be fun to portray kind of what a benighted, privileged idiot she was, kind of running around like the White House, doing Ronnie's schedule based on whether Aquarius is rising or whatever. But then I realize that's boring and it's not interesting, and it's morally not complex. See, a social novel, I think any novel that's successful has to lead the reader into their own moral confusions. It cannot be these are the good people and the bad people, because that's frankly what's killing this country, is the idea that we're just flattening the other side out, when in fact people are super complex, and they're this bewildering and inexorable mix of good motives and unseen motives that are usually more inimical or destructive. Somebody like Nancy Reagan in the book does these things that she cannot realize are racially paranoid and that are deeply destructive and morally lazy and ... But at the same time, the deeper I wrote into the story, I realized, wait a second, her husband has just been shot and almost killed, and she loved her husband and adored him. And the reason she doubles down on astrology is she believes that that is going to keep him safe. That wacky belief system is going to keep her husband safe, who she both adores and also believes is destined to lead the country to this greater place. And I think the book is partly trying to take that myth, the gauzy myth of the Reagan Revolution, that there's this mansion on the hill, and say, hold on a second, dude, who lives in the mansion, right? And who cleans the mansion? And who's going to get arrested if they trespass upon the mansion? So, I'm trying to kind of ask those questions that I think we should have been asking a long time ago. But I'm also trying to understand what I have in common with Nancy Reagan, which is I will adopt any belief system that will keep my people safe. That I totally get. And most of us end up making decisions in our personal lives and even in our public lives that can be profoundly destructive. We never see ourselves as the bad actor. We tell ourselves a story that justifies all of the screwed up things we end up doing. And so I wanted to, the reason that the book shifts around in point of view and keeps entering into each character's story is because I wanted to complicate them and understand, how did they come by these particular bigotries? How did they come by these bad stories about themselves? Not just, oh, Nancy Reagan was such a superficial jerk, and watch her be a jerk to, in a way that costs this family so much. And I really felt better when I was sympathizing and digging beneath the surface of my own bigotry, because I carried around that idea of Nancy Reagan as this kind of ditzy idiot for years. And that's not the writer's job. We're the fools in charge of forgiveness. We're the people who are supposed to be trying to understand why everybody does what they do and feel sympathy. And anytime we fail to do that, we're giving our reader permission to not enlarge their moral imagination, to kind of double down on their own bigotries and their own sense of assurance.
I mean, what struck me most about what you just said is this feeling of like beginning in a place of, what do I have in common with this person? And like that as an activator for good character creation and good storytelling. And I want to get more into that in a minute with your main character. But another thing about the book that I just couldn't help but notice is, Steve, I mean, you're so known for a kind of Hallmark style, this kind of like quirky, sardonic, kind of very voicey style to so much of your short fiction. It's funny above all. And while there are funny moments in this book, that is not the priority of the voice, I find. I mean, I felt like here you were trying to tell a swift story, a page-turning story, that the prose was sort of leaning forward in a way, and not calling attention to itself in any way. I mean, I felt like here's a man with a story he needs to tell. And I wanted to ask you about that. It's sort of an interesting division between the work that you're known for and the voice of this work.
Yeah, almost want to not apologize exactly, but to say to people who know my stories, like, it's not going to be like horny, neurotic guy, going after or young or woman. It's not going to be that kind of a story. And it's not inflected with the comic impulse, which I use in most of my stories to kind of deal with the tragic circumstances. There's always, or most often, because that's how I am in real life, that comic impulse is my particular adaptation to the astonishing sorrows of the examined life, right? I kind of go, okay, so I don't weep and become disconsolate. Let me step back and recognize the absurdity of it. But in this book, although there are sort of moments that are like maybe a little bit witty or kind of get at the truth quick enough that maybe they'll elicit a laugh, it's dead serious. And it's interesting to think about, like, when my first story collection came out 1 million bong hits ago, it was like the title story was My Life in Heavy Metal. And that was about like a young guy who reviews heavy metal concerts in El Paso and, kind of screws around and screws up his personal life and hurts people. But there was all this kind of antic, funny writing about the absurdity of heavy metal and that kind of toxic masculinity. And that was where I was at 20 years ago, when I was looking at the sexual idiocy of my 20s and trying to understand what I was up to, what I was playing out. And that's cool. That's great. I'm delighted that I got some purchase on that young idiot who was, stumbling around El Paso and going to Metallica concerts with his awful mullet. Like, great, he got his time. But now I'm 40 years out from the experience of having lived in El Paso and moved there straight after college as a very sheltered white person, sort of going, holy crap, that's the Rio Grande. Holy crap, those young women coming across that muddy river on the shoulders of these guys they pay to take them across are actually coming to work in the United States. They're scampering up this embankment and, invading the country. They're having to change into their like work clothes at dawn, shivering, hoping a INS van isn't going to come. And it took me like 40 years to realize, what I'm actually witnessing from my balcony, sipping my latte, is the criminalization of the American dream. Like, that's what I was watching. And I wrote this book in 2 bursts. The first was before the 2016 election. The second was after. And we will all remember, because we were a part of it. We witnessed it. We were complicit in it, that by 2018, 2019, the United States government is literally tearing traumatized refugee families apart. Little kids are being removed from their parents and guardians, having already traveled 1,000 miles from home through terribly dangerous circumstances. that moral event occurred. It was the greatest atrocity of the Trump regime, and that's saying something. And it made me aware that the way in which the book was traveling into the stories of the undocumented people within it and what happened to them was morally necessary and urgent. The biggest question you can ask as a novelist is, or writer is, to whom are you directing the reader's attention? Who matters? Whose circumstances matter and whose inner life matters? And for me, anyway, after lots of years of writing stories that were more comic and more kind of concerned with the crisis of finding love or the creative class and those kinds of subjects, it was like time for me to really reckon with what it was like to live and report in El Paso and later in Miami, which were cities that were dominated really by the immigrant experience. So that's just me like growing the F up a little bit. And I'm sorry that, like the comic impulse wasn't always there to rescue the characters, but that's life, dude. The comic impulse isn't always there.
Oh, and Steve, to be clear, I'm not saying that like I missed it or I was like really wanting it or anything like that. I mean, this is just a different kind of book with a different style. Yeah. And I think if anything, it's a testimony to your versatility, that you're able to kind of tell this kind of leaning forward, urgent, sort of police procedural. I mean, the great, hilarious Steve Almond is now like taking a turn and trying something new. I mean,
that's it.
It was actually like totally refreshing and awesome. And I was like, this is another side of Steve. So I loved that about it, actually.
Yeah, I didn't take you. I'm so sort of saying that maybe with a little bit of heat because I'm aware there's that voice within me saying, boy, you got serious. And boy, but I also feel like, hey, it took me so long. I tried to write so many novels that were comic and antic and that mined that voice and so forth. And they didn't succeed because I didn't find the characters interesting enough. They were probably too similar to me. And I just sort of pushed them around and let them passively observe things. I think I really had to step away from myself and into all of these other characters who frankly have much less power and a much smaller margin for error in their lives in order to really be able to articulate and morally imagine people who have wildly different places in what we call the American dream or just in American society. And that's not exactly a shock because what I've done, Mark, and you're kind of pointing this out by implication, in my nonfiction work, I've been trying to sort of apprehend where our public morality is. So you have these books like Against Football or Bad Stories. And then in my, much of my short fiction, it's more antic and more character driven and voice driven. With this novel, I finally realized actually all of those moral concerns can be combined with your interest in the characters' inner lives. And that amalgam creates something that can be both a thriller and a social novel, but also a page turner.
So I want to get into this a little bit, because it's sort of inevitable with a book like this and sort of where we are right now in the discussion around literature, the issue of representation. And of course, it's not news to anybody who would listen to this show that the winds are blowing really strong about, who has the right to tell whose story. The thing that got me, Steve, about it was I can't remember where I read you saying this or I heard you say it, that you said a couple of things. First, it was curiosity that drove you. You were just sort of not curious about the white man that you are, like that kind of person. A, you've written about him before, but B, just at the place in life that you're at, it's like that person is just not interesting. But I think what struck me even more was that at some point I saw you say that you felt you had a lot emotionally in common with the Honduran immigrant teenage protagonist of your book. And that was like such an interesting thing. And it sort of implies the point of view that like, why would it necessarily be if fiction is emotional autobiography at its heart, right? And every work of fiction is charged with the autobiographical emotions of the author, though it be disguised in different characters. Why would it be that any author would feel they have the most emotionally in common with their own gender or their own race or their own sexual orientation? Why wouldn't you have more in common sometimes with somebody of a different gender or a different race?
Right. Or this is a description in some ways of the relationship between Lorena and Marcus Stallworth, who's the dad in this glamorous family. And he looks at Lorena and says, oh my God, here is a young woman who is living not in poverty, but close to it, as I did. Here is somebody who's brilliant, who has a brilliant scientific mind, and who is courageous and is trying to enlarge the story that they're living, like me. And that's sort of the charge of their relationship. There are other kinds of charges, erotic charges, that are, far more troubling and problematic. But I think, generally speaking, your job is not to be the commissar when you're writing something and say, am I allowed? Where are we with the culture? Like, if your attention is directed at how something's going to be received, it's naturally moving away from who you should be paying attention to, which is the characters that the muse brings into your life of whatever stripe, and that you are called to investigate. I'm thinking about, like, Toni Morrison. Somebody asked Toni Morrison, like, does William Styron have the right to write the Confessions of Nat Turner? And she was like, of course, everybody has the right to write about whatever they want. That's artistic freedom. But there is also the important question, especially for people of insane privilege like me, who were, born on third base, and to have to really teach myself not to believe that I hit a triple, but to get that I just have all these inherent advantages. If you are going to write about people who have less power and privilege, well, then you damn well better seriously investigate the larger systems of power that created that inequity that allows you to sit around thinking about characters and writing novels and teaching, at fancy schools, as I've been able to. Sorry. And I think also the reader and critic gets to judge. Like, nobody should inhibit themselves from the effort. But if I screwed up in some way, if I, fell short of investigating truthfully in a thoroughgoing way, both the inner lives of the characters and their experiences, and also the larger systems of power in which they operate, well, then by all means, call me out. Because at least at that point, we will be having a discussion. I will have directed the reader's attention to people who just have they're born into a much more difficult story. And that is, regardless of whether I did it well enough to merit praise or criticism, that then at least we're talking about that population. Since a lot of the book is about whether Lorena is going to become visible and the dangers that come along with becoming visible. For me, it was partly about, once she walked into the muse, walked her into my life, I was like, okay, that's it. I'm in a ride or die situation, because I love this character so much, and I can see the way in which she is going to be unwittingly complicit in a horrible situation that's going to suck her and her family into this terrible vortex. And I am just chasing an authentic version of what would happen, as she proceeds through that story. I'm not asking any questions other than, what would Lorena do in this moment? What would she think? What would she feel? And then later, what would Toni, her older brother, and Graciela, her mother, what would they think and feel? What would they remember? When you're doing that work, that's the novelist's job. It's not to think about, am I allowed or am I not allowed? That's not to say that the sort of crisis of underrepresentation it totally exists. And thank God we're in an era where finally the literary world, which is only one place in our culture, right? In some places in the culture, this is totally regressing. And people of power, usually white privileged people, are absolutely furious that they are being asked to give up whatever share of the pie they have occupied, right? Or they were born into. But in the literary world, there's a long overdue reckoning with the fact that dudes who look like us and are dudes have had the central megaphone. And if you think about it from that vantage point, there's a part of me that says, well, good. I don't want to write about my experience. I don't mean that it's not interesting. Everybody has a fascinating, tumultuous inner life. But I am more interested in directing my attention and the reader's attention to a whole range of characters, some of whom have a lot of privilege, but the central characters have much less power, and understanding how they can get sucked into a horrible, tragic situation that is not exactly unique, right? I mean, the Innocence Project exists because there are literally thousands of people who are wrongly incarcerated. It's not like it's some rare esoteric thing that hardly ever happens. It happens all the time.
Yeah.
I think part of those concerns are probably the concerns of the investigative reporter who did long complicated stories as a journalist about the ways in which systems of power always have hidden incentives and blind spots that end up getting people unfairly executed, imprisoned, in some way or another, put in trouble.
Thanks, Steve. That was sort of a tour de force answer. I really appreciated that. Thank you. Clearly, folks, Steve has thought a lot about this, and I'm really glad you have, Steve. That was incredible. Folks, if you have questions for Steve, pop them in the chat. And a few more questions from me before we get to that. Steve, you gave a great talk that I saw once, and we're going to link to that in the chat, about how kind of dark and forbidden obsession is one of the main ingredients of compelling character creation. And certainly there is a dark, forbidding obsession, an erotic obsession at the center of this work involving a few of the characters. And there's just some great quotes from that talk you gave. You said, "The dark knowledge of who we are collides with the Facebook version of ourselves." Right. And that society tries to socialize us out of our obsessions, but the obsessions then become spring-loaded by the act of that suppression. And I just wanted to, again, turn the mic back over to you about just in this work, talk about how this theory of yours of, the forbidden obsession, the not cool, not acceptable, really, outright sort of bad obsession is the thing that gives life to a narrative.
Yeah, if like when I look on social media and I'm partaking of this because I want to let people know I have readings and please get the book and all that stuff. It's okay, but it's marketing, right? That's what it is. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it is a more subtle form of marketing, like a sort of marketing of your virtue or a marketing of your good taste or whatever it is. And that's cool. I get it. We all need our eggs, and the internet and social media has accelerated our kind of metabolism when it comes to that narcissistic need. We need that dopamine hit. But what's really interesting to me is the stuff people are sort of tuck under the pillow of their privacy, like the stuff that they won't tell anyone, their secrets. If you really want to, like, to me anyway, like the most interesting thing that I could find out is somebody's secret, somebody's kink, somebody's fetish, somebody's phobia, the thing that they have to live with alone, and that they feel too ashamed of to tell anyone else. And that extends to like people's failure. I think there should be like an alternative Facebook where everybody just writes about what's really happening. Like, here's the photo we took, but like 5 seconds later, I had this terrible passive aggressive blow up with my partner. And then like, I was super disappointed in my kid being such a finicky little such and such that I literally wanted to smack him. I didn't smack him, but I kind of shoved him. They fell over. Anyway, that would be like, I would read that all. But that doesn't exist because right. We're kind of in, especially under the aegis of late model capitalism, we're all just kind of constantly trying to market this fraudulent version of ourselves. Yeah. And for me anyway, one of the things that's great about going into a piece of fiction is that your job is to push the secrets out into the world, is to push them out into the open. Your job is to get a character or more than one character to run up blindly against the truth of themselves. That's where the equity is. That's where the juice is in a piece of writing. And that is really the opposite of our impulse as civilians, where we're really trying to keep insulated from the dark knowledge of who we are. We don't want too much of that to escape out into the open because we'll be judged, and the truth of who we are will be revealed, and we'll be like, the little towel that protects our vanity is ripped away, and everybody goes, oh boy, that's disappointing.
All right. So Steve, we have only a few minutes left, but this has been amazing. And we haven't gotten to nearly all the questions that I wanted to ask. I sort of can't go to audience questions before asking you a little bit about the process of you putting this novel out. Famously, this is now kind of in all the news coverage of this book coming out. Everybody always says it took him 30 years to write this novel, and that's such a big number. And you went through
feels great.
Yeah, it feels great. But I think like where it comes from is not like you're a debut author who's never published a book of any kind and it took you 30 years. Like, that's not a story. But Steve Almond, who's many times over an award winner and New York Times bestseller, taking 30 years. Now that's interesting. So I guess just to boil it all down to kind of like a single question, I guess one way to say it is, why did it take so long? But I'm curious maybe to phrase it a different way. how did you know that this time was different?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's very obvious when you're, for me anyway, very obvious when you're writing, when you're pushing. And
Mm,
it's equally obvious when you're being pulled through. I think of it as like when I put the book down, I'd written maybe 200 pages, and then the 2016 election happens, and I kind of go nuts, and the pressure of the reel just like squashes my imagination. Um, but when I came back to it, it had energy.
mm,
Like it was still, the characters were still alive, they were still in crisis, and I was voraciously curious about what was going to happen. And I didn't know that was going to happen because I'd set it down. I thought maybe it will go cold and go stale. So the way I could say it is, it's not just that feeling of you're being pulled through by the characters' behaviors and their actions by which they're either going to be happy or unhappy, right? But it's also just an intuitive feeling of I still feel curious. I
right.
still want to know. I still want to see these people into their danger and see if they're going to make it through that danger. It
Yep.
gives you energy rather than the feeling I had when I would work on these other books, which is I didn't really know the story. And so I was really pushing around the language and using the things that I did know how to do, which is to try to be funny and witty and, turn a phrase and all my old tricks. But when you're flogging the language, it's usually because you're trying to solve a story problem. And for me, once I realized, no, the story's actually in place, and I'm plagued by trying to figure out, is Lorena gonna like rescue her people, or are they not gonna get rescued? That was just pulling me through the thing. That was a very different sensation. I think a lot of it also has to do with ego need.
Mm-hmm.
Just ego need. Like I wanted to be a novelist rather than being genuinely interested in the fate of the characters. And it was very different this time around. I was just like, I got to just see Lorena through this.
Yeah.
Screw what happens, whether it sells or sells any copies or even gets published. I just have to, I have an obligation to this character in this story that's more interesting to me than my need for acclaim or to have it get published or anything.
I remember talking to you about it kind of when, a couple years ago when you were still in the midst of writing it and you hadn't even found an agent for it, even maybe, I think, and just saying that, like, how compelled you were to finish the story, and just those very things that you just said, that like it wasn't, you're like, I don't know if this is going to get published, but I am going to finish writing this. I mean,
Right. And that's a great feeling, by the way, to uncouple artistic creation from financial or narcissistic expectation.
Yeah.
It's the greatest feeling because it's such a feeling of
Mm.
liberation. You know you're doing the work, and the rest is totally out of your control, honestly. I could have seen that this book, I got lucky, an agent who dug it and a brilliant editor who dug it and loved that it was shape-shifting and all this stuff. But it just as well, if it had been a different agent or that agent had passed on it or that editor hadn't been in a position to make a purchase, it might not have happened. It would still be the same book. You have to esteem who you are and what you're doing. And when you know you've got your hands on a really good story, that's its own reward. The rest is complete, like for the world to decide.
All right, one last question from me, and then we'll take two questions from the audience. But Steve, I want to call attention to one of the greatest answers that I've heard you give about something, about a topic, which is writer's block. And you basically have said, I've heard a few different times you say, but it's just kind of it bears repeating for everybody watching this show who is a writer, a published writer, aspiring to be a writer, just about how to deal with writer's block and how it has to do with kind of lowering your expectations and just opening yourself up to just doing something instead of nothing. I love your attitude about writer's block.
Yeah, it's like lower the bar. And Americans are so averse to that. They have to like achieve at every level. And like, actually just lower the bar. And it was actually writing Candyfreak that taught me that, because I'd failed at a novel, as I always was. And then it stripped me down to like, what will get me to the keyboard? That's my advice. If you're in writer's block, it's because you're feeling writer depression and writer self-doubt, and find the thing that is more interesting to you than that particular psychodrama.
Yeah. All right, let's take a couple questions from the audience. If our producer could pop them up there. Okay, what's next? More nonfiction, more fiction? What are you working on?
I am working on a craft book that is tentatively titled "Truth is the Arrow, Mercy is the Bow," and it's a very like I've done all this teaching for many years. I find myself developing a certain like set of theories about character and plot, and it takes a long time to figure out and refine, but then I've kind of got it down. And I do that to classrooms individually. And I was finally like, yeah, actually, I think I might want to scale this up, because I also am interested in the psychological and emotional barriers that keep people from doing good creative work. And those are as important as technical matters of craft. I'm also interested in the way that commerce collides with art, and how to keep art straight in your head when it's under the aegis of commerce. So it's kind of this, it's like a DIY kit for the creation of literature. And it's kind of nuts, but I'm totally into it.
And when might that be out?
I don't know. We will see. I don't know if it'll even get taken, but I'm more interested in the writing of it than that question. I hope it finds, awesome. I hope it comes out. That would be awesome.
Yeah. All right. Let's do one more quickie, because we're almost out of time from the audience. What are you reading? What were you writing? Now we have, what are you reading right now? Thank you.
Right at this moment. I'm reading the question at the bottom of the screen. I mean, really, the novel that I finished most recently was this novel, A Tiny Upward Shove, that my former student, Melissa Chadburn, wrote. She was a student of mine. I was going to say I was a student of hers, because that's how I felt after reading the book. I was like, oh, did I teach her? Did she actually teach me? Because it's just brilliant and virtuosic. And it's the same kind of arc as Secrets, a young female heroine who's kind of up against it. But I saw that book and it was revelatory. I saw that book in really early drafts. I saw it, 10 years ago or 12 years ago. And it was fascinating to see that long journey. My 30 years was mostly spent excreting terrible novels and then feeling like a failure, then writing something like a piece of nonfiction that I felt I could do, or a collection of stories. But for Melissa, and this is really instructive for people who are writers, she just believed and knew that that was the story that she was called to tell. And she just worked on it and worked on it, until that bad boy is just on fire. And it was such a joy to read it and realize, and to see all of the brilliant decisions that she had made, both in sort of what to take out, but also how to really create a narrator who could tell this big, sprawling, amazing story. Tiny Upward Shove by Melissa Chadburn.
Yeah, we got it on the bottom of the screen. Check that out, folks. We'll put a link to it. All right, so we're going to wrap now. I usually have one question that I end with, but I got to ask one extra small question first. Steve.
Okay, I'll be quick.
Steve.
Yes.
If you have pocket sevens and the flop comes 10-6-4, what do you do? What do you do with that hand?
What I probably do, just from personal experience, is I go all in, and you inevitably call me, and you've got pocket fours, and you've got a set, and then I pretend to be gracious for about 30 seconds, and then I get off the Zoom, and I stick daggers and pins in my thoughtful bro doll, but it's usually right into the hat. Like I try to rip the hat off, the hat's sewn on.
It's funny. My hat always hurts after we get off. Like my head. Yeah. Maybe that's
what that's about.
All right. So, and then this is the true last question that I always ask, which is, imagine you have the ideal reader for All the Secrets of the World, somebody who's just getting everything that you're up to, and just receiving the book in just the way you dreamed it would be received, in the best case scenario. And then imagine that ideal reader has finished reading the book. Just describe for me in a word or a phrase, what is the feeling that reader has?
I think what I would say is that they feel like they want to be angry, but that they don't. That their anger is sort of larger than the characters. That there's no one character that they can single out to be angry at, because the characters actually are acting in their own, in what they take to be their own best motives. But that's the trick of the social novel. Like I've heard people react to the book and say, it made me so angry. And I'm like, yeah, good. Sometimes books have that effect, that they direct us towards things that we should be angry about. I'm saying this on a day where the reproductive rights of all women, but especially poor women who might not have access to the ability to, get health care and particularly to have their reproductive rights exercised is essentially going to be removed.
Mm-hmm.
Like, people should be outraged about that and galvanized, and they should be in the streets about it. And literature is a part of all that. It involves us. And when you enter into the project of making writing, you're not a pamphleteer, you're not a rhetorician, but you are a part of the world that you're writing about. And sometimes the story you have to tell, people might be grateful for it, they might be enthralled by it, but they might also be really pissed off. And maybe that is something that gets them off their duff and into the world of taking moral action.
I mean, talk about a subject ripe pretty soon for a social novel. I mean, that would be one. You know, it's like some of this issue that you got to take on from all sides. Anyway, Steve, the book is so terrific. Here it is, folks. Go ahead. You bought 10 copies earlier. Go ahead and buy another 10, because maybe the purchase didn't go through. So just go ahead and do it again. It's such a triumph, Steve. I was so happy. I knew it would be good, but just honestly, it surpassed my expectations by a great deal. I mean, it was a wonderful read. And the thing I want to point out is the page turning aspect of it is what just impressed me so much. I mean, you have so many other skills. You have this kind of incredible wide range of literary talent, but I didn't know you had this in your quiver. I was mildly, greatly jealous to see what you did.
I certainly didn't either. Like, if you had said, oh, the novel you're finally going to write is going to be this thing that's like a thriller, essentially, I would have been like, what are you, crazy? I don't even know how to like plot a short story. That's like way out of my bailiwick. But like I say, you know, when Lorena came along, and, you know, it's quite organic. Her circumstances and who she collides with just pulled me through it. And sometimes, like, the muse is a lot smarter than you are.
That is a great line to end on. I love that. The muse is sometimes a lot smarter than you are. Steve, thank you so much for being here on your pub day. Congratulations on the book. This has been quite a treat for me.
Yeah, me too, man. I had a great time.
Great. All right, folks. We'll see you next week on Thoughtful Bro with Trisha Blanchett, who's going to be talking about her debut called Herrick's End. Thanks to A Mighty Blaze and Jenna Blum for producing, and we'll see you next week, folks.